The morning sun was just beginning to cast its golden rays across the vast expanse of the Florida Everglades when Sarah Mitchell, a 34-year-old cattle rancher, stepped out onto her front porch with a steaming cup of coffee in hand. The air was thick with humidity, and the familiar sounds of the wetlands were already in full chorus as herons called out across the marshes and alligators bellowed in the distance. Sarah had lived on this land for nearly 12 years, having inherited the ranch from her grandfather, and she thought she had seen everything these wetlands had to offer. But nothing could have prepared her for what was about to unfold on this seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning in late spring. Sarah was making her usual rounds, checking on the cattle that grazed near the eastern pastures, where the solid ground gradually gave way to the more treacherous swampland. Her boots squelched through the muddy terrain as she counted heads, ensuring all her livestock were accounted for and healthy. The ranch sprawled across 800 acres, and much of it bordered the wild, untamed sections of the Everglades where wildlife roamed freely. Sarah had always respected the delicate balance between her cattle operation and the natural ecosystem, understanding that she was merely a guest in a landscape that had existed long before humans arrived. She had encountered black bears, bobcats, and even the occasional Florida panther over the years, but she maintained a healthy distance and a deep respect for these creatures that called the swamps home. As she approached a particularly dense section of marsh grass near the property's southern boundary, Sarah heard something unusual. It wasn't the typical sounds of the swamp that she had grown accustomed to over the years. This was different, more desperate, more urgent. It was a series of low, guttural calls that seemed to pulse with anxiety and fear. Sarah paused, her hand instinctively moving to the radio clipped to her belt, and she listened carefully, trying to determine the source of the sound. The calls continued, growing more insistent, and Sarah felt a chill run down her spine despite the warm morning air. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and whatever creature was making those sounds needed help immediately. Following the direction of the calls, Sarah carefully picked her way through the marsh grass, her experienced eyes scanning the ground for the telltale signs of unstable terrain. The Everglades were notorious for their patches of quicksand and deep mud pits that could trap even the most cautious traveler. She had lost a young calf to quicksand 3 years ago, and the memory of that helpless animal struggling in the thick, viscous mud still haunted her. As she pushed aside a curtain of Spanish moss hanging from a cypress tree, Sarah froze in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing on a partially submerged log about 30 feet away, was a magnificent jaguar, her golden coat spotted with distinctive black rosettes, her amber eyes fixed intently on something below her. The jaguar was pacing back and forth on the log, her movements agitated and frantic, and as Sarah's eyes followed the cat's desperate gaze, she understood immediately what was happening. There, in a patch of dark, churning quicksand, a small jaguar cub was trapped, its tiny head barely visible above the surface of the thick mud. The cub couldn't have been more than 4 months old, and it was struggling weakly, its energy clearly fading as the quicksand slowly but inexorably pulled it deeper. The mother jaguar turned her head toward Sarah, and in that moment, something extraordinary happened. The wild cat didn't flee, didn't show aggression, didn't display any of the typical defensive behaviors one would expect from a mother protecting her young. Instead, she looked directly at Sarah with eyes that seemed to convey a desperate plea, a universal cry for help that transcended the boundaries between human and animal. Sarah's mind raced as she assessed the situation. She knew that jaguars were incredibly rare in Florida, with only occasional sightings reported in recent years as these magnificent cats slowly began to reclaim their historic range. This mother and her cub represented not just individual lives, but the hope for the species' recovery in the region. But more importantly, in that moment, Sarah didn't see an endangered species or a statistical anomaly. She saw a mother desperately trying to save her baby, and she saw a helpless infant animal fighting for its life. Every instinct Sarah had as a rancher, as someone who had spent her entire life working with animals and understanding their needs, told her that she had to act, and she had to act quickly. The problem was that approaching a wild jaguar, even one in distress, was incredibly dangerous. Jaguars possess one of the most powerful bite forces of any big cat, capable of crushing skulls and piercing turtle shells with ease. A frightened or cornered jaguar could easily kill a human, and Sarah was under no illusions about the risk she was taking. But as she looked at the struggling cub, now barely keeping its nose above the surface of the quicksand, she knew she had no choice. She couldn't stand by and watch this baby animal die, not when there was something she could do to help. Sarah quickly radioed her ranch hand, Marcus Thompson, a 28-year-old man who had been working with her for the past 5 years and who she trusted implicitly. "Marcus, I need you at the South Marsh immediately," Sarah spoke into the radio, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Bring rope, lots of rope, and the long poles we use for fence repair. And Marcus, there's a jaguar here, a mother and cub. The baby's trapped in quicksand. I'm going to try to help." Within minutes, Sarah could hear the sound of Marcus's ATV approaching through the brush, and soon he emerged into the clearing, his arms loaded with coiled rope and several long wooden poles. His eyes widened as he took in the scene before him, the massive mother jaguar still pacing on her log, her gaze alternating between her drowning cub and the 2 humans who had just arrived. Marcus whispered urgently, "Miss Sarah, that's a jaguar. A real jaguar. We should call Wildlife Services. They have the equipment and training for this." But even as he spoke, the cub's head dipped below the surface of the quicksand, and the mother jaguar let out a cry that could only be described as heartbreaking. Sarah shook her head firmly. "There's no time, Marcus. That baby will be gone before anyone can get here. We have to do this now. I need you to help me. But if you're not comfortable with it, I understand. You can stay back and call for help. But I'm going in." Marcus looked at his employer, at the desperate mother jaguar, and at the disappearing cub, and he nodded. "I'm with you, Miss Sarah. Just tell me what to do." Sarah quickly formulated a plan. She would use the longest pole they had, which was about 15 feet in length, to try to reach the cub and either push something solid beneath it or hook it and pull it toward more stable ground. Marcus would hold the safety rope attached to Sarah's waist, ensuring that if she started to sink into the quicksand herself, he could pull her back. The most critical unknown was how the mother jaguar would react. Would she understand that they were trying to help, or would her protective instincts override everything else and cause her to attack? Sarah made a decision that went against every bit of conventional wisdom about wildlife encounters. She would talk to the mother jaguar, maintaining eye contact and using a calm, soothing voice, hoping that somehow the cat would understand her intentions. Slowly, carefully, Sarah approached the edge of the quicksand, the rope secured around her waist and Marcus holding it tight from a position behind a large cypress tree. The mother jaguar watched every movement, her body tense, her muscles coiled, ready to spring at a moment's notice. Sarah began to speak in a low, gentle voice, the same tone she used with frightened horses or nervous cattle. "It's okay, Mama. I see your baby. I'm going to help. I promise I'm going to try to help. Just let me help, please." The jaguar's ears twitched at the sound of Sarah's voice, and incredibly, the cat seemed to relax slightly, though her eyes never left Sarah's face. It was as if some ancient understanding passed between them, a recognition that in this moment, they were both mothers in their own way, both creatures who understood the desperate need to protect the young and vulnerable. Sarah extended the pole out over the quicksand, carefully probing for the cub. The quicksand was deeper than she had initially thought, easily 6 feet deep in the center, and the cub had already sunk considerably. Sarah's heart pounded as she maneuvered the pole, trying to get it beneath the small animal without pushing it deeper. The cub was barely conscious now, its struggles having ceased almost entirely, and Sarah knew they were running out of time. Behind her, Marcus called out encouragement and warnings, his own voice tight with tension. "A little more to the left, Miss Sarah. You're almost there. Watch your footing. That ground looks unstable." Sarah adjusted her position, feeling the earth beneath her boots beginning to give way slightly, the telltale sign that she was at the very edge of the quicksand's reach. Finally, she felt the pole make contact with something solid, the cub's small body. She carefully adjusted the angle, and then, using the curved end of the pole like a hook, she began to slowly, inch by inch, draw the cub toward her. The quicksand was reluctant to release its prey, creating a sucking resistance that made every movement exhausting. Sarah's arms trembled with the effort, sweat pouring down her face despite the morning coolness. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The mother jaguar had moved to the very end of her log, watching with an intensity that was almost palpable, her entire body vibrating with tension. Sarah could hear the cat's low, rumbling vocalizations, sounds that seemed to encourage her to continue, to not give up, to save her baby. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 3 or 4 minutes, Sarah managed to pull the cub close enough that she could reach it with her hands. The small animal was completely covered in thick, dark mud, its fur matted and heavy, its eyes closed. For a horrible moment, Sarah thought they were too late, that the cub had already drowned in the quicksand. But then she saw the tiny chest rise and fall with a shallow breath, and hope surged through her. She grabbed the cub firmly but gently, and with Marcus pulling on the safety rope, she backed away from the quicksand's edge, the small jaguar cradled against her chest. The cub was surprisingly heavy, probably weighing around 25 pounds, and it was completely limp in her arms, its breathing labored and irregular. Sarah immediately began clearing the mud from the cub's nose and mouth, using her fingers to scrape away the thick substance that was blocking its airways. The cub coughed weakly, expelling mud and water, and its breathing improved slightly. Sarah continued to work on the small animal, gently massaging its chest and clearing more mud from its face, all while keeping one eye on the mother jaguar. The big cat had leaped from her log and was now slowly, cautiously approaching, her movements careful and deliberate. Sarah knew this was the most dangerous moment. The mother could easily interpret Sarah's handling of the cub as a threat, and in a split second, the situation could turn deadly. But instead of attacking, the mother jaguar stopped about 10 feet away and let out a series of soft, chuffing sounds, the kind of vocalizations that big cats use to communicate with their young. The cub in Sarah's arms responded weakly to its mother's voice, stirring slightly and opening its eyes for the first time. Sarah made a decision that Marcus would later describe as either the bravest or most foolish thing he had ever witnessed. She slowly, carefully, placed the mud-covered cub on the ground between herself and the mother jaguar, then backed away several steps, giving the mother clear access to her baby. For a moment, nothing happened. The mother jaguar looked at Sarah, then at her cub, then back at Sarah, as if trying to understand this human who had just saved her baby's life. Then, in a movement so quick that Sarah barely had time to register it, the mother jaguar was at her cub's side, nuzzling it with her massive head, licking the mud from its face with her rough tongue, making those soft, chuffing sounds continuously. The cub responded to its mother's attention, moving its legs weakly and making tiny mewing sounds. It was alive, it was breathing, and it was being reunited with its mother. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and overwhelming emotion at witnessing this incredible moment. Marcus had emerged from behind the cypress tree and was standing beside her, his own eyes wet, his hand on her shoulder in silent support and admiration. The mother jaguar continued to clean her cub, paying particular attention to clearing the remaining mud from its airways and face. After several minutes, seemingly satisfied that her baby was going to recover, the mother cat gently picked up the cub by the scruff of its neck, the way cats carry their young, and turned to look at Sarah one final time. In that moment, Sarah felt something pass between them again, a connection that she would struggle to put into words for the rest of her life. It wasn't gratitude exactly, though Sarah sensed that too. It was more like recognition, an acknowledgement from one being to another that they had shared something profound, that they had worked together to preserve life, to fight against death, to ensure that this small, innocent creature would have a chance to grow and thrive. If you're watching this and you're as moved by this incredible story as we were in researching and sharing it, we'd love to hear from you. What would you have done in Sarah's situation? Have you ever had a wildlife encounter that changed your perspective on the natural world? Drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more amazing stories of courage, compassion, and the incredible bonds that can form between humans and animals. Your engagement helps us bring more of these stories to light, and we read every single comment. Now, let's continue with what happened next. because this story is far from over. The mother jaguar turned and began to walk away, carrying her cub into the dense vegetation of the swamp. Sarah and Marcus watched until the cats disappeared from sight, the distinctive spotted coat of the mother blending perfectly with the dappled shadows of the forest. For several minutes after the jaguars had gone, neither human spoke. They simply stood there, processing what they had just experienced, trying to make sense of the extraordinary events of the morning. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "Miss Sarah," he said quietly, "I don't think anyone is going to believe this when we tell them." Sarah laughed, a sound that was part relief, part exhaustion, and part pure joy. "I'm not sure I believe it myself, Marcus. And I was right here." They gathered up their equipment and began the walk back to the ranch house, both of them moving slowly, as if reluctant to leave the site of such a momentous event. As they walked, Sarah's mind was already racing ahead to what needed to happen next. She knew she had to report this sighting to the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission immediately. The presence of a breeding female jaguar with a young cub was incredibly significant for conservation efforts, and biologists would want to know every detail. She also needed to document everything that had happened while the memories were still fresh. But more than anything, Sarah felt a profound sense of responsibility to protect this jaguar family, to ensure that they could continue to live and thrive on and around her property. Over the next few days, Sarah worked closely with wildlife officials to share information about the jaguar sighting and rescue. Biologists from the Conservation Commission came out to the ranch and set up remote cameras in the area where the rescue had occurred, hoping to capture footage of the jaguar family and learn more about their behavior and territory. Dr. Jennifer Wong, a 42-year-old wildlife biologist who specialized in large predators, interviewed Sarah extensively about the encounter. Jennifer explained that jaguars had been nearly extinct in the United States for decades, with only occasional individuals wandering up from Mexico. The fact that there was now confirmed breeding activity in Florida was extraordinary news for conservation efforts. Dr. Wong told Sarah that the mother jaguar's behavior during the rescue was particularly remarkable from a scientific standpoint. Jaguars are typically extremely wary of humans and will go to great lengths to avoid contact. The fact that this mother had essentially asked for help and then allowed Sarah to handle her cub suggested a level of intelligence and adaptability that researchers were only beginning to understand in big cats. "It's possible," Dr. Wong explained as she reviewed Sarah's account of the rescue, that this mother jaguar had observed human behavior before and had somehow learned that humans could be helpful rather than threatening in certain situations. Or it could have been purely instinctive desperation, a mother willing to take any risk to save her offspring. Either way, what you witnessed and participated in was truly extraordinary. The remote cameras that the biologists installed began to yield fascinating results within the first week. The mother jaguar was frequently photographed moving through the area, and she was often accompanied by not just the one cub that Sarah had rescued, but by a second cub as well. This meant that she had successfully raised twins, a significant feat for any large predator, especially in an environment where they were trying to re-establish themselves. The footage showed the mother teaching her cubs to hunt, to navigate the swamp, and to avoid the various dangers that existed in their territory. Sarah watched the footage with a mixture of pride and wonder, knowing that the small cub she had pulled from the quicksand was now thriving and learning the skills it would need to survive. But not everyone in the community was pleased about the presence of jaguars in the area. Some of Sarah's neighboring ranchers expressed concerns about the safety of their livestock and even their own families. At a contentious county meeting held about 6 weeks after the rescue, several ranchers demanded that the jaguars be removed or relocated to a more remote area. Sarah found herself in the unusual position of defending the big cats, arguing passionately that these animals had every right to exist in their historic range, and that humans needed to learn to coexist with them rather than simply eliminating any wildlife that might pose a potential inconvenience or threat. "I understand the concerns," Sarah told the assembled group of ranchers and county officials, her voice steady and confident. "Believe me, I have livestock too, and I have a vested interest in protecting them. But these jaguars aren't the enemy. They're survivors, fighting to reclaim a place that was taken from them. I've been implementing better fencing and security measures on my property. and I haven't lost a single head of cattle since the jaguars have been in the area. These cats are smart. They know there's plenty of natural prey out there, wild hogs, deer, and they don't need to risk attacking livestock. We can live alongside them if we're willing to make some accommodations, and if we're willing to see them as valuable members of the ecosystem rather than as threats. Sarah's impassioned defense of the jaguars, combined with strong support from environmental groups and wildlife officials, helped to ease tensions in the community. The county eventually approved a comprehensive wildlife management plan that included compensation for any ranchers who could prove they had lost livestock to jaguar predation, funding for improved fencing and security measures, and an educational campaign to help residents understand jaguar behavior and how to safely coexist with these magnificent predators. Sarah became something of a local celebrity, though she was uncomfortable with the attention. She was interviewed by newspapers, television stations, and even national wildlife magazines, all wanting to hear the story of the woman who had saved a baby jaguar from quicksand and lived to tell about it. But for Sarah, the real reward came on a warm evening in early autumn, about 4 months after the rescue. She was sitting on her porch, watching the sun set over the wetlands, when she saw movement at the edge of the tree line near her property. She reached for her binoculars and felt her heart skip a beat as she focused on what she was seeing. There, clear as day in the fading light, was the mother jaguar, and both cubs were with her. They were significantly larger now, probably close to 40 pounds each, and they were practicing their stalking and pouncing techniques on each other the way young cats do. The mother was watching her cubs play, occasionally intervening to correct their technique or to break up any play that was getting too rough. As Sarah watched through her binoculars, the mother jaguar suddenly turned and looked directly at Sarah's porch, almost as if she knew Sarah was there and watching. The big cat held Sarah's gaze for a long moment, and then, in a gesture that Sarah would replay in her mind for the rest of her life, the jaguar dipped her head slightly, almost like a nod, before turning and leading her cubs back into the forest. Sarah lowered her binoculars, her hands trembling slightly, and she felt tears running down her cheeks again. It was a goodbye of sorts, an acknowledgement that their brief connection had been real and meaningful, and a reassurance that the jaguar family was thriving. Marcus had seen the exchange from where he was working in the barn, and he came up to the porch to stand beside Sarah. "You think she remembered you, Miss Sarah?" he asked quietly. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice for a moment. "I know she did, Marcus. I don't know how I know, but I do. She remembered, and she wanted me to see that her babies are okay, that they made it." Marcus smiled and put his hand on Sarah's shoulder again, a gesture that had become familiar between them since the day of the rescue. "You did a good thing, Miss Sarah. A brave thing." Sarah shook her head slightly. "It wasn't about being brave, Marcus. It was about doing what needed to be done. That mother was asking for help, and I couldn't turn away. Any decent person would have done the same." But both of them knew that wasn't entirely true. Many people would have called wildlife services and waited, or they would have been too afraid to intervene, or they would have seen the jaguar as a threat rather than as a desperate mother seeking help. Sarah had made a choice in that moment to see the situation for what it really was, to look past the species barrier and the very real danger, and to act from a place of compassion and courage. And that choice had saved a life, preserved a family, and given hope to conservation efforts that were working to restore one of North America's most magnificent predators to its rightful place in the ecosystem. The story of Sarah's rescue of the jaguar cub spread far beyond her local community. Wildlife organizations around the world used her story as an example of the kind of positive human-wildlife interactions that were possible when people approached these situations with empathy and understanding rather than fear and aggression. School children wrote letters to Sarah, asking about the jaguars and expressing their own desire to help protect wildlife. Documentary filmmakers contacted her, wanting to create a film about the rescue and about jaguar conservation efforts in Florida. Sarah agreed to participate in one documentary, but only on the condition that the focus would be on the jaguars and on conservation efforts, not on her personally. The documentary, which was titled Return of the Jaguar, premiered on a national wildlife network about a year after the rescue, and it featured extensive interviews with Sarah, Marcus, Dr. Wong, and other conservation professionals. It also included incredible footage from the remote cameras that had been monitoring the jaguar family over the months since the rescue. The two cubs that Sarah had seen playing on that autumn evening had grown into strong, healthy young jaguars, and the documentary showed them learning to hunt, to establish their own territories, and eventually to separate from their mother as they reached maturity. The film was well received and won several awards for wildlife filmmaking, but more importantly, it helped to change public perception about jaguars and about the importance of large predator conservation. Sarah continued her ranching operation, but she also became an advocate for wildlife conservation, speaking at schools, community groups, and conservation conferences about the importance of coexistence between humans and wildlife. She worked with Dr. Wong and other biologists to develop best practices for ranchers who might encounter jaguars or other large predators on their property. She helped to establish a wildlife corridor on her land that allowed jaguars and other animals to move safely between different sections of habitat without coming into conflict with human activities. And she continued to monitor the jaguar family, working with biologists to collect data that would help inform conservation strategies for years to come. 5 years after the rescue, Sarah received word that the cub she had saved, which biologists had designated as Jaguar F201 based on the photo patterns of her spots, had given birth to her own cubs. Sarah was invited to accompany Dr. Wong and her team on a monitoring trip to see if they could observe the new family. They hiked deep into the swamp, following the GPS coordinates from the remote cameras, and eventually, they spotted the young female jaguar that Sarah had rescued, now a mature adult at around 27 months old, and fully capable of protecting and providing for her own offspring. F201 was resting on a fallen log, and 2 tiny cubs were nursing, while a third cub playfully batted at its mother's twitching tail. As the group watched from a safe distance, F201 suddenly lifted her head and looked directly at Sarah, just as her mother had done so many times before. The recognition in that gaze was unmistakable. This was the cub that Sarah had pulled from the quicksand, now a mother herself, successfully raising the next generation of jaguars in the Florida Everglades. Dr. Wong whispered excitedly, "This is it, Sarah. This is what conservation looks like." One life saved 5 years ago has now resulted in 3 more jaguars. The population is growing. They're coming back. Sarah nodded, too overwhelmed with emotion to speak, watching as F201 gently nuzzled her cubs and then closed her eyes, trusting that she and her babies were safe, at least for the moment. The success of the Florida jaguar population has become a conservation success story that continues to inspire efforts to protect and restore large predator populations throughout North America. Researchers have documented over 40 individual jaguars in Florida and the surrounding Gulf Coast states, a dramatic increase from the 0 breeding animals that were present just a decade ago. The population is still vulnerable, still facing threats from habitat loss, vehicle strikes, and occasional illegal hunting, but it is growing and establishing itself in areas where jaguars haven't been seen in over a century. And at the heart of that success story is a moment of connection between a human and an animal, a moment when a desperate mother asked for help, and a brave woman chose to answer that call. Sarah's life has been forever changed by her encounter with the jaguar family. She still runs her cattle ranch, still makes her morning rounds checking on her livestock, still navigates the challenging terrain of the Everglades with the same careful expertise she's always had. But now she walks with the knowledge that she shares this land with some of the most magnificent predators on Earth, and that knowledge fills her with a sense of purpose and responsibility that extends far beyond her property lines. She knows that every decision she makes, from how she manages her pastures to how she talks about wildlife with her neighbors, has the potential to impact the future of these animals and the ecosystem they inhabit. Marcus is still working with Sarah, and he often jokes that the rescue of the jaguar cub was the most exciting thing that has ever happened to him and likely ever will happen. But he also takes his role in that rescue seriously, and he has become an advocate for wildlife conservation in his own right, speaking to local youth groups about the importance of protecting natural habitats and the incredible diversity of life that exists in the Everglades. He and Sarah have developed additional protocols for responding to wildlife emergencies on the ranch, and they've helped several other animals over the years, including a young alligator that had become entangled in fishing line and a barred owl that had been injured in a storm. The mother jaguar that Sarah rescued the cub from, designated by researchers as Jaguar F189, remained in the area for several more years, successfully raising multiple litters of cubs and teaching them to navigate the complex ecosystem of the swamps. She was photographed by remote cameras hundreds of times, and she became something of a celebrity in the conservation community, with researchers and wildlife enthusiasts following her movements and her offspring with keen interest. In total, F189 is believed to have produced at least 8 cubs that survived to adulthood, a remarkable reproductive success that has significantly contributed to the growing jaguar population in the region. Unfortunately, F189 was killed in a vehicle strike on a rural highway when she was approximately 8 years old, a tragic reminder of the ongoing threats that these animals face even as their population recovers. But F189's legacy lives on through her offspring, who continue to thrive in the Everglades and surrounding areas. Several of her cubs have themselves become parents, creating a growing family tree of jaguars that can all trace their lineage back to that desperate mother who sought help from a human on a spring morning, and to the brave woman who chose to answer that call. Biologists estimate that nearly a quarter of the current Florida jaguar population can be genetically traced back to F189 and her successful breeding, making her one of the most important founders of the restored population. Sarah has also noticed changes in how other wildlife interacts with her property. She's seen increased numbers of deer, wild hogs, and even the occasional black bear, all benefiting from the healthier ecosystem that has developed as large predators have returned to the landscape. The presence of jaguars has helped to control prey populations, preventing overgrazing and allowing vegetation to recover in areas where it had been heavily impacted. This in turn has benefited countless other species, from small mammals and birds to reptiles and amphibians, creating a cascade of positive ecological effects that extend far beyond the jaguars themselves. The quicksand area where Sarah rescued the cub has become something of a pilgrimage site for wildlife enthusiasts and conservationists who visit the region. Sarah has worked with local authorities to create safe viewing areas and educational signage that tells the story of the rescue and provides information about jaguar conservation. She's careful to balance public access with the need to protect the jaguar's habitat, and to ensure that human activity doesn't disturb the animals or put either people or wildlife at risk. The site has become a powerful symbol of what's possible when humans choose to help rather than harm, to protect rather than destroy. As Sarah reflects on that morning 5 years ago, she often thinks about the split-second decisions that led to the successful rescue. What if she had hesitated for just a few more seconds? What if she had decided that calling wildlife services was the safer option? What if the mother jaguar had attacked instead of allowing Sarah to help? Any of these alternative scenarios could have resulted in tragedy, but instead, through a combination of courage, quick thinking, compassion, and perhaps a bit of luck, a life was saved and a conservation success story was born. Sarah doesn't see herself as a hero, despite the awards and recognition she's received. She sees herself simply as someone who did what needed to be done in a moment of crisis, guided by the values that her grandfather had instilled in her about respecting and protecting the land and all the creatures that inhabit it. The story of Sarah's rescue of the jaguar cub has been told and retold countless times, inspiring similar acts of courage and compassion around the world. Wildlife rescuers in Africa, Asia, and South America have cited Sarah's story as motivation for their own work, and conservation organizations have used it as an example of the positive impact that individual actions can have on species recovery and ecosystem health. But perhaps the most important legacy of that morning in the Everglades is the simple reminder that we share this planet with countless other species, and that we have both the power and the responsibility to help them when they're in need. The years following the rescue brought numerous changes to both Sarah's ranch and the broader conservation landscape of Florida. The jaguar population continued to grow steadily, and researchers documented increasingly complex social behaviors among the cats, including cooperative hunting between siblings and extended maternal care that lasted longer than had been previously observed in South American jaguar populations. Dr. Wong theorized that the Florida jaguars were adapting their behavior to the unique challenges and opportunities of the Everglades ecosystem, developing strategies that were specifically suited to the wetland environment. This behavioral plasticity, the ability to adapt and modify behaviors in response to environmental conditions, was seen as a positive sign for the long-term viability of the population. Sarah's ranch became an unofficial research station for jaguar studies, with Dr. Wong and her team making regular visits to check camera traps, collect scat samples for genetic analysis, and monitor the health and movements of the jaguar population. Sarah learned to identify individual jaguars by their spot patterns, which are as unique as human fingerprints, and she kept detailed logs of every sighting, every track, and every sign of jaguar activity on her property. This citizen science contribution proved invaluable to the research effort, providing data that would have been impossible to collect through formal research methods alone. Sarah's intimate knowledge of her land and her daily presence allowed her to notice subtle changes and patterns that visiting researchers might miss. The relationship between Sarah and the scientific community deepened over time, and she was eventually asked to serve on the board of directors for the Florida Large Carnivore Conservation Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting and studying jaguars, Florida panthers, black bears, and other large predators in the state. In this role, Sarah used her unique perspective as both a rancher and a conservationist to bridge the gap between agricultural interests and wildlife protection goals. She helped to develop compensation programs that were fair to ranchers while still maintaining strong protections for wildlife, and she worked tirelessly to educate other landowners about the ecological and even economic benefits of supporting large predator populations. One of Sarah's most significant contributions to conservation efforts came when she decided to place a conservation easement on a substantial portion of her ranch. This legal agreement permanently protected 600 of her 800 acres from development, ensuring that the land would remain as wildlife habitat in perpetuity, even after Sarah was no longer the owner. The decision wasn't easy, as it reduced the potential resale value of the property and limited what future owners could do with the land. But Sarah felt strongly that the jaguars and all the other wildlife that depended on the habitat deserved permanent protection. "The land is not really mine," she explained during the easement signing ceremony. "I'm just a temporary steward, passing through. The jaguars were here long before humans arrived in Florida, and if we do our job right, they'll be here long after we're gone." The conservation easement on Sarah's property created a crucial link in a larger network of protected lands that stretched across southern Florida, creating a wildlife corridor that allowed jaguars and other animals to move freely between different habitat patches. This connectivity was essential for the long-term genetic health of the jaguar population, as it prevented isolated groups from becoming inbred and allowed for the natural dispersal of young animals seeking to establish their own territories. Wildlife biologists celebrated Sarah's easement as a model for how private landowners could contribute to landscape-level conservation efforts, and several other ranchers in the region followed her example, protecting their own lands through similar agreements. Marcus, who had been at Sarah's side during the rescue and throughout the years that followed, eventually decided to pursue his own education in wildlife biology. Inspired by his experiences on the ranch and his growing passion for conservation, he enrolled in a university program while continuing to work part-time for Sarah. She supported his educational goals wholeheartedly, adjusting his work schedule to accommodate his classes and even helping to pay for his tuition. Marcus's senior thesis focused on human-jaguar conflict resolution strategies in working landscapes, and he conducted much of his research right on Sarah's ranch, interviewing neighboring landowners about their attitudes toward jaguars and documenting the effectiveness of various deterrent methods for protecting livestock. The day Marcus graduated with his degree in wildlife ecology was one of the proudest moments of Sarah's life. She attended the ceremony along with Dr. Wong and several other members of the research team who had worked with Marcus over the years. After graduation, Marcus accepted a position with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, where he would be working directly on jaguar conservation and human-wildlife conflict resolution. But he maintained his close relationship with Sarah, visiting the ranch regularly and continuing to collaborate on research projects. The bond that had been forged between them on that morning when they saved the jaguar cub had evolved into a deep friendship and professional partnership that would last throughout their lives. As the jaguar population stabilized and grew, new challenges emerged. Some jaguars began to expand their territories into more heavily populated areas, leading to increased encounters with humans. While most of these encounters were harmless, with the jaguars avoiding direct contact and moving on quickly, there were a few incidents that raised concerns. One young male jaguar was struck and killed by a vehicle on a major highway, highlighting the need for wildlife crossing structures that would allow animals to safely navigate the increasingly fragmented landscape. Another jaguar was found dead from what appeared to be poisoning, though it was never determined whether the animal had been deliberately targeted or had consumed poison intended for other species. These incidents galvanized the conservation community and led to increased funding for jaguar protection efforts. The state allocated money for the construction of wildlife underpasses at key locations along major highways, allowing jaguars and other animals to cross roads safely. Sarah worked with engineers to identify the best locations for these crossings, using her knowledge of animal movement patterns and the data from camera traps to ensure that the structures would be placed where they would do the most good. She also helped to organize community watch programs, training volunteers to monitor for signs of illegal hunting or poisoning, and to report any suspicious activities to wildlife officials. The education and outreach efforts that Sarah had been involved with from the beginning continued to expand and evolve. She developed a partnership with local schools, hosting field trips to her ranch where students could learn about jaguars and wetland ecosystems in a hands-on environment. She worked with teachers to create curriculum materials that aligned with state education standards while fostering an appreciation for wildlife and wild places. Thousands of students visited the ranch over the years, and many of them went on to pursue careers in conservation biology, environmental education, or natural resource management, citing their visit to Sarah's ranch and the story of the jaguar rescue as formative experiences that shaped their life paths. Sarah also began to document her own experiences through writing, publishing articles in conservation magazines, and speaking at conferences around the country. Her presentations were always well attended, as people were drawn to her authentic voice and her ability to communicate complex conservation concepts in ways that resonated with diverse audiences. She spoke not just about jaguars, but about the broader challenges of maintaining biodiversity in working landscapes, about the economics of conservation, and about the ethical responsibilities that come with land ownership. Her message was consistently hopeful, emphasizing that conservation success was possible when people were willing to make space for wildlife and to see themselves as part of the natural world rather than separate from it. 10 years after the initial rescue, Sarah organized a major symposium at the University of Florida, bringing together ranchers, conservationists, researchers, and policymakers to discuss the future of jaguar conservation in the southeastern United States. The symposium featured presentations on the latest genetic research, on the ecological role of jaguars in the Everglades ecosystem, on economic analyses of the costs and benefits of large carnivore conservation, and on case studies from other parts of the world where humans and big cats had learned to coexist. Sarah gave the keynote address, titled Living with Legends, in which she shared her personal journey from cattle rancher to conservation advocate, and reflected on how the rescue of a single jaguar cub had changed not just her life, but the trajectory of wildlife conservation in Florida. The symposium concluded with the announcement of a major new initiative, the Jaguar Coexistence Program, which would provide technical assistance, financial support, and educational resources to landowners throughout the jaguar's expanding range. Sarah was named as the program's first director, a position that would allow her to dedicate more of her time to conservation while still maintaining her ranch. She hired a manager to handle the day-to-day operations of the cattle business, freeing her to focus on the work that had become her true passion, The program quickly became a model for human-wildlife coexistence efforts, and it attracted funding from conservation organizations, government agencies, and private donors who were inspired by the story of the jaguar rescue and by Sarah's vision for a future where people and predators could thrive together. As Sarah approached her mid-40s, she began to think more seriously about the long-term legacy of her conservation work. She had no children of her own, and while she had built deep relationships with numerous young people through her educational programs, she wanted to ensure that the work she had started would continue long after she was gone. Working with attorneys and conservation organizations, Sarah established the Mitchell Jaguar Fund, an endowment that would provide perpetual funding for jaguar research, habitat protection, and coexistence programs in Florida. She contributed a substantial portion of her own wealth to the fund, and she organized fundraising campaigns that brought in additional millions of dollars from donors around the world who had been touched by the story of her rescue of the jaguar cub. The remote camera network that had been established in the years following the rescue had grown into one of the most extensive wildlife monitoring systems in North America, with hundreds of cameras scattered across the Everglades and surrounding areas. The thousands of images captured by these cameras provided an unprecedented window into the lives of jaguars and the other species that shared their habitat. Researchers pored over the images, identifying individual animals, documenting behaviors, mapping territories, and tracking the dispersal of young animals as they left their mothers and established their own ranges. The data collected through this network contributed to dozens of scientific papers and helped to inform management decisions at both the state and federal levels. One of the most exciting discoveries to emerge from the camera trap data came when researchers identified a male jaguar that appeared to have dispersed all the way from Mexico, traveling over 1,200 miles to reach Florida. This finding confirmed that there was still genetic connectivity between the Florida population and the much larger populations in Central and South America, which was crucial for maintaining genetic diversity and preventing inbreeding. The discovery also highlighted the importance of maintaining wildlife corridors not just within Florida, but across the entire southeastern United States and into Mexico, a conservation challenge that would require coordination across international boundaries and among multiple governmental jurisdictions. Sarah's work increasingly took on an international dimension as she was invited to share her experiences with conservationists in other countries who were working on similar human-wildlife coexistence challenges. She traveled to Brazil to learn about jaguar conservation efforts in the Pantanal, to India to discuss tiger conservation with communities living on the edges of protected areas, and to Kenya to explore lessons from decades of work on human-lion conflict. These experiences enriched her understanding of conservation and provided new perspectives that she brought back to her work in Florida. She saw that while the specific details varied from place to place, the fundamental challenges and opportunities were remarkably similar wherever humans and large predators came into contact. The jaguar family that Sarah had helped to save continued to thrive and expand. By the 15-year mark after the rescue, F201, the cub that Sarah had pulled from the quicksand, had produced 4 litters of her own, and some of her offspring had themselves become parents. The genetic legacy of that one rescued cub now included over 30 individual jaguars, representing a significant portion of the entire Florida population. Researchers marveled at this remarkable reproductive success and at the robust health of F201's descendants, which seemed to be particularly well adapted to the Everglades environment. Some biologists speculated that F201's early traumatic experience with the quicksand might have made her an especially cautious and attentive mother, passing on both genetic and learned behaviors that enhanced the survival of her offspring. Sarah made it a tradition to visit the site of the original rescue every year on the anniversary of that momentous morning. She would hike out to the edge of the quicksand, which had become more stable over the years as vegetation grew around its edges, and she would spend time in quiet reflection, thinking about all that had changed since that day and all that had remained constant. She thought about F189, the mother jaguar who had trusted her with her cub's life, and she felt a profound sense of gratitude for that moment of connection across the species divide. She thought about all the jaguars that now roamed the Everglades, living their wild lives largely unseen by human eyes, and she felt pride in knowing that her actions had contributed to their survival and success. On the 20th anniversary of the rescue, Sarah organized a major celebration at the ranch, inviting everyone who had been part of the conservation effort over the years. Dr. Wong was there, now in her early 60s and preparing for retirement, still sharp-eyed and passionate about jaguar conservation. Marcus was there with his wife and 2 young children, having built a successful career as a wildlife biologist and continuing to work on human-wildlife conflict issues throughout the southeastern United States. Dozens of researchers, volunteers, fellow ranchers, and community members gathered to celebrate not just the anniversary of the rescue, but the remarkable conservation success story that had unfolded from that single act of courage and compassion. Before we wrap up this incredible story, we want to hear from you, our amazing community of wildlife enthusiasts and compassionate souls. Stories like Sarah's remind us that courage and compassion can change the world, one life at a time. If this story moved you, if it inspired you, or if it gave you hope for the future of our planet's incredible biodiversity, please consider subscribing to our channel. We share stories like this because we believe they matter, because we believe that the connections between humans and wildlife are profound and worth celebrating, and because we believe that every one of us has the power to make a difference. Tell us in the comments about your own experiences with wildlife, or share how this story impacted you. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to choose between safety and compassion? What would you have done in Sarah's situation? Your stories and insights enrich our community and remind us all that we're part of something larger than ourselves. And if you learned something from Sarah's incredible journey, share this video with others who might be inspired by it. Together, we can build a world where humans and wildlife not only coexist, but thrive side by side, where stories like Sarah's become not the exception, but the norm. Thank you for being here, for caring, and for being part of this community dedicated to celebrating the incredible diversity of life on Earth.